Oh hi everyone, today's video is how I did Mocha on her facial markings here in Pastels. Her portrait is a prime example of what you typically hear me talk about in my videos. This is more important to get the contrast and your values right, your lights light enough and your darks dark enough, more so than focusing on the exact colour. Now the reason for that is her black markings are right up against some white markings and ginger markings, so if you did not get these contrasts and the values correct, it would be really flat. So your colour could be spot on, but if you haven't got your contrast there, then the portrait is not going to have that realistic and that wow factor that we're going for. If you are interested in watching content such as this, the 3-hour version of this is over on my Patreon channel. I made this a focus video over on my Patreon channel, so because I know that if this was a portrait that I was given and I was first starting off, these markings and the contrast would have been something that I would have struggled with. So I made this into a long, in-depth video breaking down each process and explaining it thoroughly, so that if you were to have a portrait such as this, that it would enable you to put these techniques into the portrait that you are working on of something very similar. Now this process would also be how I would tackle a brindle type of dog fur, so that would also be something similar should you have a portrait like that as well. Each of my videos has in-depth step-by-step voiceover, so if that is something that you are interested in, then there is a link in the description to my Patreon channel. So I haven't included her eyes in this video. That is also going to be linked in the description below, because I have made a separate YouTube video of that explaining how I did those. So if that is of interest, then that is also in the description below. Just like you may have seen on my other videos here, I apply my base layers with my soft tools. I've got a piece of sandpaper to the side of me, I've sanded down my soft pastel sticks, and I'm applying that pigment directly to the paper. Once I've got a good base layer down and I'm happy with that, I'm then going to start working with my pastel pencils. Now at the moment all I'm really doing is refining my base layers, putting in where the general fur direction flows, where it travels and how it sits. That's all I'm focusing on at the moment. You're not looking to be applying any kind of detail. As I say, you are just wanting to refine those base layers, get in where your general lights and darks are, putting in your stripes or your markings, whatever it is that you may be working on. This is also how I would do stripes and spots, so I will tend to block in where those areas are first, so that you've got a good reference point when you are looking back at your photograph that you're working from. Regardless of what you're working on, one of the most important things I think is your base layers. Sometimes the base layers are overlooked, and I think that it does make the process very, a lot more difficult in the long run. If you can get your base layers accurate and already map in where your lights and your darks are, it's going to make it so much easier when you go over the top with your pastel pencils. Now you'll see that the fur markings on her face are travelling in very different directions. It's really, really important to pay close attention to your reference photo when there are, regardless of what you're working on, but especially when the fur changes in so many ways like what it is doing here. If you don't capture the direction of that fur, it's not really going to look like that pet at the end. The reason why the fur changes direction is it's following the bone and muscular structure of that animal. If you change that fur direction, you're going to then change the shape of that animal's face, and therefore obviously it's not going to look as much like that pet or that animal as it should. So you'll see that once I've got that general direction of the fur in, I'm now going over with my pencils working from dark to light. Each layer that I'm adding is slightly lighter or a lighter colour than the base layer that I've already put down. Now this portrait was an A4 size, which is approximately 8 by 12, and it is a full body portrait, so she's actually laying down, so all of her body is in this portrait. So this area of her face is not going to be as large as if it would have been a head and shoulders type of portrait. So you always have to bear that in mind when you're working on a slightly smaller size and you're trying to fit the whole body in, that you may not get as much detail as you would be able to get should you just focus on the head alone. Now that being said, you can still get a load of detail. As you can see here, I'm building up that texture of that fur really nicely because I'm working with really sharp pencils and a light hand. One thing I go in depth in my Patreon videos about is how to hold the pencil and how much pressure to put on that pencil to get the different fur strokes that you're after. Now it's very much like when using a paintbrush, depending on all of those properties that I've just mentioned, how much pressure, how you hold it, it is going to create different pencil strokes and give you different fur textures or whatever it is that you might be drawing, depending on how you're applying that pencil to the paper. So that is something that I go in depth with in my videos because I do think it's really important. You'll see just from this video, even though it is sped up, how I'm moving my hand, how I'm always positioning it slightly different. Sometimes I'm holding it in the middle of the barrel and sometimes I'm holding it closer to the lead of the pencil. There are reasons why I'm holding it in these different ways, and as I say, it gives you many different types of fur strokes and different kinds of depth depending on the texture of the fur or whatever it is that you might be drawing. And if you have seen any of my other videos before, you know that I like to work in small areas at one time. So once I've got one area about 80% complete, I will then make a start on the next portion of that portrait. Now for me, this was then the left side of her eye and just below on her cheek area. Now the reason why I like to work in these small areas is because I think that it breaks up that portrait and makes it less daunting. When you're working on something like this that has a load of complex facial markings, regardless of if it is a tiger for instance or a leopard with a load of spots, if you were to tackle that as one massive portrait, one layer at a time, I think you are more likely to sit there and think, oh, I'm getting lost on my reference photo, I don't know exactly where I am, and you sit there not intentionally wasting more time, but because you're hesitating more often, you are therefore not spending as much time progressing on the portrait as you may do if you were to break areas up, smaller areas like what we're doing here. Another reason why I like to break it up into small areas is because I like to see my portraits coming together, and looking more like that animal. These areas are about 80% complete, and then when you look at your reference photo, you can see that this looks like that pet. And for me, that gives me far more motivation to carry on than if you were always stuck at that ugly stage. Now, every portrait goes through an ugly stage. Look at this layer here that I'm doing now. It looks absolutely terrible. And me personally, if I was to be doing layer by layer individually, all over the entire subject, and working in that way, which again, if that is your way of working, that is absolutely fine. But for me, being stuck in that ugly stage would be more, I'd get more disheartened with the portrait. I'd feel like I'm not progressing as much as I may be. So that's why I also break it up into small sections. When you are drawing an animal with difficult markings like this, the key to it is making sure that these markings are in the right place. Now you have to also, as I mentioned, get the fur direction in the right, that has to be correct. But if you get these markings slightly to the left, the right, or too high up for instance, it is not also going to look like that animal. These markings often follow, because they are part of that fur direction, they follow the bone and muscular structure. It is really, really important. One of the biggest tips that I can give you if you are working on an animal like this, take a couple of minutes to look at your reference photo before you start. Now the reason why I say that is sometimes what you're drawing doesn't actually make sense, and sometimes you look at it and you think, well, why is there a highlight there? Why is that darker there? Now most of the time it's because there is a like a pocket in, like for instance in this part of the ear here on the cat. The ear is set slightly higher and further back on the skull, so it creates that dip as it goes back into the back of the ear. So that is going to naturally be more darker than the front portion of her face. So by looking at your reference photo and studying why these areas are light, why are they dark, you get more of an understanding of that structure of that animal, which does definitely make it far easier to then understand why your values need to be in those places. So when you're working on an area such as this, if your light areas are not showing up well enough, it is more likely than the reason is because your base layers are not dark enough. If your highlight layers are just not as vibrant as you're wanting, because we have the benefit, especially if you are working on Pastelmat, that you can layer your lights on top of your darks. If you are not getting that correctly, it is usually because your base layers are too light, and obviously then the lighter layers can't show up as well. So if that is the case, blend out the layer of pencil that you've just applied, make your base layer darker, and then reapply your lighter layers on top. And when you're working on anything, any ears, dogs, cats, whatever it might be, you need to try and, as with any kind of fur that you're drawing, you need to focus first on the fur that is closest to the skin. Now for anything with ears, especially with cats, because they don't have that fluffiness to the ear, it is mainly just the skin colour at the back. So you're wanting to ignore all those white fine hairs that you typically see and try and forget all of that and look right through those layers to what would be right at the back. And at the moment that's exactly what we're working on now. So I am using a mixture of my pencils, my Derwent, Caran, my Carbothello and my Pitt pastel pencils for this. Just blending each layer, getting my highlights and my shadows in the right place. And with something like this, especially on cat's ears, the layers are very blended, it's very soft. There's not usually any sharp lines or sharp edges. So getting those base layers nice and blended will mean that you can overlap these hairs that I'm working on now much easier. Now, regardless of the medium that you are working on, I would always recommend using something to rest your hand. What I'm using here is something called Glassine. It's acid free and it just stops you from putting any of your oils of your skin in contact with the paper, and obviously we have to be aware with pastels that you don't want to smudge your work. So if you don't have Glassine, anything is better than nothing. I mean, printer paper, anything like that. Obviously I highly doubt that that was going to be acid free, but you know, anything under your hand is better than nothing at all. But the reason why I use Glassine, as I say, is it's archival and I know that it's not going to affect the quality of my portrait later on down the line. If you have been working in pastels and you cannot get the detailed layers on top, it's one of the most common questions I'm asked, and there's usually two reasons for that. One will be the paper. I opt for using Pastelmat because it takes an endless amount of layers. I've only ever filled the tooth of the paper once, and that was my error, and that was because I'd applied my soft pastel sticks directly to the paper and I'd filled the tooth of that paper too quickly, which meant I could not then go over the top with my pastel pencils. Now, I have had a few questions with you know, other artists saying they're using this paper and why aren't my portraits getting that kind of detail that I'm after, and that will be because the paper is not really, although it's advertised as pastel paper, it's not got that same toothy surface that you need to be able to layer and layer and layer and create all that depth, which is what, you know, how you can create that realistic portrait like what we're going for. So for me, 100% my choice for paper is Pastelmat, and if you are using Pastelmat and as I mentioned you are struggling with getting your detailed layers on top, the reason for that most of the time is that you filled the tooth of the paper. Now, as I say, I have done this once before, and that's because I use my soft pastel sticks directly to the paper. Now what that does is, because the stick pigment is much softer, you are tempted, you can fill up the tooth of the paper that much quicker. Now, I am actually going to be buying a few pan pastels to see whether or not I like them, but I do think that that pigment looks just as soft, so I think that that would also run the risk of doing that as well. But I am going to give them a go and I'll let you know what I think of those when I get them. But if that is something that you are struggling with, it is normally because you have filled the tooth of the paper. Now, if that does happen, I personally hate throwing artwork away because I think that you learn from these types of mistakes. So for me personally, I would probably buy, or if you have it, use a workable fixative, apply a layer of that over the top to get some tooth back onto your paper. Now, I don't use fixatives at all because I do use Pastelmat, I don't need them, but if you are using a workable fixative, then go ahead and do that to put more tooth, but I would advise not to use that on the end layer once you're finished with your portrait because it can cause the colours to shift. Now, the good thing with Pastelmat is it grips that pastel pigment and you don't actually need to put any fixative on top. I always send out my portraits mounted, and then I always tell my clients to get them framed so that they are protected. Once they're behind glass, they're absolutely fine. But if you are someone that likes to use fixatives, just be aware that if you are going to, you know, spray them on your finished portrait, they are renowned for changing the tone and the colour of your artwork. Me personally, I have tried them, and each time, you know, I've only tried it twice because the first time I thought it might be my error because it's the first time that I used it, but it had the same effect on the second artwork and I refused to waste any more of my drawings. You know, we spend so many hours on this artwork. I was gutted when it ruined my artwork. I actually threw it away because of the effects that it made on it. So it's just something to bear in mind if you are someone who does want to use fixatives. But as I say, if you're using a workable fixative just to apply some more tooth to that paper, it really doesn't matter if it changes the colour, because you're going to be going over it with additional layers anyway. So for this side of her face, now that I've blocked in the darkest area, it's now given me a really good foundation to apply these lighter fur details on top. Now in this area it was mainly black, but I personally wouldn't like to leave it just flat black, even if that's what your reference photo called for. Now sometimes that can be because your reference photo is lesser quality. If that is the case, I would go onto somewhere like Pixabay, a royalty-free reference site, get a picture of a cat of a similar pose to get an idea of the fur direction, and I would add, like what I've done here, even if it's just a couple of fur strands, just to apply some detail in that area. This is where we can use a bit of our artistic license and improve our portraits compared to the reference photo that we may have been given. Now that wasn't the case in this instance. I did have a good photograph to work from, but in these darker areas of fur it is quite easy for that detail to get lost. So that is all I would do. I'd get another photograph that I have access to and just put in some subtle details just so that your portrait looks that much more realistic. So you'll notice that on this portrait I've used the pencils to put my base layers down, and I've also then used my soft tools with my pastel pigment. Now the reason why I'm showing both ways here is because I'm aware that some people may not have soft pastel sticks, so I wanted to show that you can do your base layers with both options and that you will get the same results with either. Now if you are struggling with which colour to pick, because this is something with markings like this, you know, she's got very strong ginger markings here. If you have a pet portrait you're working on and you're struggling with what colour to choose, I've got a video here on YouTube on how I would advise for you to pick your colour. There is an app, and you can get it on most laptop photo editors as well, called an eyedropper tool, and that will help you to identify the colour that you need to be aiming for. Now obviously if only there was just that right pencil that was the exact right colour that we needed, that would be perfect, but that is often never the case. As you can see with how many layers we put down, it is all about a layering process and blending in those layers to create the final colour that you're after. But I will put a link in the description below for this how to pick your colour video, because that is something that may be useful if it is something that you do struggle with. But as I mentioned, colour is not the be all and end all. Your contrast is much more important. If you look at how we are now on this portrait, if I did not get those darks as dark as I have done, the portrait would be really flat. So you can get the colour spot on. But if I hadn't got this marking on her nose with this that goes right up to her left eye, nice and punchy and dark, I would not be creating that 3D effect of the bridge of her nose. So it's things like that that I think personally are more important than focusing on have I got the right colour. Because you could take this reference photo of this animal in slightly different lighting and this ginger tone would look different. I was given 25 maybe photos of this cat and each one looked slightly different. So just bear that in mind. You want to be making sure that your values are correct, because that is what's going to make your portrait stand out to any viewer that looks at it. A big tip if you are working on markings such as this is if you've got any kind of striped marking, don't have one area solid up against the next. You don't want any sharp lines. You want these fur, like what I'm working on here, to overlap each section. You would never just have a solid line because of how the fur curves and how it flows, regardless of the subject that you're working on. Even if you've got a dog such as a Staffordshire Bull Terrier, for instance, with short fur, you would still have some fur details that overlap that marking. So don't have straight harsh lines, because you'll be creating something more cartoony rather than more realistic. So another tip to bear in mind if you are working on something like this, regardless of maybe if it is a leopard with a load of spots or you have got a cat or a dog with similar markings to this, it would be much more time effective to put in your initial sketch with where these stripes and spots are initially. You don't have to go and draw every single one, but if you look at your reference photo and there are 10 for instance that stand out to you, draw them in your initial sketch so that you're not you find it easier to stick to your reference photo, especially if you are doing something like this. Like I made sure that I put those 4 sets of stripes which are between her eyes, I made sure I put those in because they need to be in the right position to make it look like that animal. So it's far better to put them in initially on your sketch and, you know, just if you don't need them, just draw straight over them, rather than not put enough in and then you're finding that you're struggling with where you are on your portrait. Now the area on her chin here is obviously very small in comparison. Look at the size of the end of that pencil. So you're not going to be wanting to add a load of detail here purely because the area is too small. So all I've done is I've hinted at the indication of that fur. You don't want to put that fur detail too long because you're going to make it look like she's got furry, like a long haired chin, which obviously she does not have. So just bear that in mind if you are working on a slightly smaller scale and then you've got areas of the portrait such as that where the area is then tiny. So you'll notice here that when I'm doing my base layers, just refining everything, I am still following the direction of the fur. It's really, really important to pay really close attention to your reference photo. And you will see, especially on these ginger areas, just how many colours I've used. I'm swapping between the various brands and also the different pencils that I've laid down at various times. Now, although I don't say exactly this is the exact pencil that I'm using all the way through, there are times like that one there was the Derwent Saffron. I'll identify those colours if I think it's important. But over on my Patreon channel, I do list in every video description the colours that I have used for that entire portrait. So if that is something that you find benefits you, if you like to know what colours to start off with, then I do have that available. But like I say, if you see me pick up a red or a brown, then pick up a red or a brown of a similar colour in your set. It doesn't have to be exact, just close. So when you're working with striped fur like this, where there is a strong difference between your lights and your darks, you do need to make sure that you're thinking one step ahead. Now what I mean by that is I've put in this darker area on her neck because her ginger face markings here overlap that dark area. If I was to work all those ginger fur strokes now and overlap that onto the dark area, I then have to go over all that detail to block in the dark section there of her neck. So I always then tend to, before I go and add those finer details to that area next to it, I always tend to block in that section beside it so that I know that I can then overlap each layer without making more work for myself in the next, in the next process. So as you can see here, now that I'm starting to work on this smaller area that I mentioned before, I'm working with really sharp pencils. When the smaller the area that you're working on, you're going to need the more sharper pencils, purely just to make sure that you get as much detail in that area as you can. Now as I say, you don't want to be forcing detail that's not there. You don't want to be drawing longer fur strokes just to try and create more detail, because you will be making that fur look longer than it should be. You do want to hint at that differences in tone. I've still made that side of her cheek there lighter than the area next to her nose, and that's because that is obviously a lighter shade of that ginger. So it's really important to still put those differences in, but don't feel like you've got to force yourself to cram in loads of detail just because you are working with a smaller area. So I hope this video was of use. If it was, I would appreciate if you give it a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe button and the bell button, and then it will alert you to any new videos that I upload. And as I say, if you are interested in my Patreon channel, the link to that is in the description below. And each month there will be a new video uploaded between 1 and 3 hours long, sometimes longer. There's a video there of my blue Staffordshire Bull Terrier that I did, which is just over 4 hours long. These videos may be a full project from start to finish, or they may just be a focus video on, for instance, how to draw curly fur. A recent video that I uploaded here to YouTube was how to draw light curly fur, and that video is available on my Patreon, 1.5 hours long, and I go in depth with that whole process on how I do that fur step by step. So if that's also of interest, that is in my Patreon channel as well. And then you will also get access from time to time to some bonus videos that I'll also upload. If there are any topics or any elements of a portrait you'd like me to cover, then please pop it in the comments below and I'll happily try and make that content for you and get that ready and uploaded. So thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye!